full album now under his solo stage name, you know.
Mhm. That's
So
it.
thank you, Erick,
Thank
for
you.
being
Thanks
here.
for having me. Should I just start going now? Are you introducing everybody?
We'll introduce
I
people
guess,
one by one and then have people speak in between, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'll get going. First, I'd like to thank Hannah for asking me to be part of the panel. It's really exciting to discuss this, this topic. Everyone perceives reality through their own lens, so it's exciting to hear other people's stories and for me to share mine. When thinking about this question, how do our senses reveal the world to us? I'm going to dance around it quite a bit. I don't know if that was actually a pun intended or not, but let's go from there. I can't help but think about music or sound first for me. How from a young age, I've often paid a great deal of attention to songs and sounds and voices, and how those things guided me and how I view people, situations, and events that were happening around me. They also helped encourage me to look for answers about myself and my own feelings, to question where those feelings come from. Who am I? I was doing this from the right age of 5. Just kidding, I wasn't. And a great deal of memories I can recall a song as being the first thing that takes me back to that, particular place. It was often a song that was important to me at the time, or simply a song that was playing in the background. I don't think that this is any sort of special gift. I think it's more of just a matter of noticing these things that were happening. When I was about 6, I had to leave daycare and go get the bus to go to school, and I was sad. The younger kids got to stay home, as I called it, and I remember this overwhelming feeling of sadness. I wanted to cry. And I didn't want to go, but the one thing that I remember the most about that experience was the fact that Inspector Gadget, the cartoon, was playing on television. And it's funny because I associate that theme song with sadness now. And it's funny, if you know the song, it's like this funky, weird detective song. And it became this early soundtrack for me, for being sad. And another one, which I don't know if the creators meant it to be like this, but "You Are My Sunshine" is a song that is so sad to me. So it's kind of funny, but I guess that's just the way it is for me. So that was all just really a long form way of saying that feelings and music are strongly associated for me. And I think about it like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You could have a peanut butter sandwich where the peanut butter is our feelings, those exist. That's okay. That makes sense to me. But when it's just a jelly sandwich, music without feeling, I don't really understand that. So from there, I'll just continue on with a little bit more of a slight biography on myself. So I grew up in a pretty emotionally reserved home. There wasn't much in terms of supportive physical contact or audible encouragement. So for me, music could be an escape from reality, but also a way of helping me to identify feelings I was having. I would often put my headphones on, close my eyes, be lost in whatever song I was listening to. And I won't go into the specific songs that affected me deeply growing up. I'd say it's quite universal to be a young person and have songs that you listen to when you're sad or when you're happy, and everything in between. What's important to me is that those songs allowed me to open up in a healthy way and help me to sit with those emotions and be present and curious with them. There was always something about music that was reliable. I could always count on to be, I don't know, just felt good, I guess, in a way. I could always count on power chords to rejuvenate me. I could always count on some early 90s rave music to inspire me to draw, to relax, and allow me to be present in the world. So to continue on with basically what I do now, when I was about 14, 15, I was hearing seamless mixes of dance music. And I guess that's how I started to really understand this idea of a journey. This is the time this is the time I fell into drawing. I would draw for hours while listening to a 3-hour DJ mix of house or techno. No more of that starting and stopping between songs that, were arbitrarily placed at the time. And there's something special about that experience. It's hard to describe with words. I describe it as similar to meditation, I suppose. And as a job, being a DJ, being up on stage, being able to know which songs are going to incite a certain reaction for people is, I'd say a pretty good trait for a DJ. So being a DJ professionally is an active, oh, sorry, I just skipped a bit, what I was gonna say. But it makes sense to me as I've gotten older and I look back on my past, why I've essentially got into what it is that I'm doing. Music is, very deeply personal, and I fear showing someone I don't know a song that is special for me, for fear of being judged. So being a professional DJ is an act of constantly questioning that voice inside of me that's trying to protect myself, and why it's protecting me. I actually don't know if I'm over time or not. I don't want to go over time.
No, it's okay. Finish what you have to say, or yeah.
Okay, I only have a little bit more. So when I'm DJing, I'm always thinking what song I can play right now that will keep the energy as high as possible. I'm looking at this large group of people in front of me, so I'm hearing what song I'm playing, I'm seeing them, and I see this large group of people, then smaller groups of friends specifically, and then each individual themselves. And when you're on stage, you're playing and you're playing a particular song, you have this like best seat in the house basically to people watch, and seeing and observing how they're moving, how they react to different parts of a song, how some of them are on their own musical journey, and being able to know which song to play for that crowd isn't what I call easy. This is where it's sort of into the space where it's like, I'm going back on knowledge of songs that I know work and songs that work for me. And, you're kind of judging how people are reacting. And I like to think of it, it's not really like oh, I'm going to do this thing. It's kind of like if you're playing Tetris and all of a sudden the straight Tetris block shows up and you're like, there it is. It's as easy as that. There you go. I've now won the game. Sometimes it doesn't always work like that. You get the terrible shaped Tetris block and then you're messed up. So it's in that space that it's hard for me to explain what that is. So I hope that I can, learn more by hearing the other panelists, because this is, completely unbeknownst to me. It's just a thing that I know when it happens, it feels absolutely wonderful, and everything seems to make sense. So I guess, and just to end it off, so when I think about the question, how do my senses reveal the world to me, I also can't help, but when I'm thinking about music, and my ability to feel it has allowed me to reveal myself to the world. So I'll end there.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. So we're going to move through these introductions, sort of starting with the most concrete. So since Erick, you're a performing DJ, you're very closely connected to the senses in real time and in real life.
Yep.
And then we're going to move next to Jen, who is a master sommelier. And so she's also very closely connected to the senses in her day-to-day practices. And then we'll move through to Mazviita and Arthur, who are more theoretical in their pursuits and more abstract in the way that they treat these subjects. So cool. I'll introduce Jen now. So Jen Hoither is a Toronto-based sommelier and wine consultant. In 2011, she became the first female in Canada to earn the Master Sommelier designation, which is the highest achievement in the wine industry, and it requires many years of intensive training in tasting, history, theory, service, and everything in between. It's a really remarkable achievement. Since then, she's really come to a place of prominence in the Canadian wine industry, and she's held all sorts of different roles throughout the food and hospitality industry. I won't even try to start listing them. She presently focuses on teaching other people about wine and sharing her knowledge and experience with others. And she's got a forthcoming book out as well, or soon to come out, I think, called The Social Herbivore with Priya Rao, which is going to be the first comprehensive introduction to the rising trend of plant-based food and wine pairing. So thank you very much, Jen, for joining us today.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be on this panel and myself learning more. Okay, where to start? So of course, I'm going to focus mostly on the nose. And I think I need to put a little context around this first, because what I do in my day-to-day life is kind of unique, I guess, using my whole senses to analyze wine. So let's think about this for a second, and why is this so relevant? So starting with the fact that we can smell up to and maybe more than 10,000 things, but we can only really taste about 5 to 7. So that being, of course, salty, bitter, umami, and things of that nature. So really, it's super important to be able to smell well for the enjoyment of food, the understanding of wine. And so what you really do in your early days as a sommelier is you're really working this whole system, and you're making these connections with your memory. Because of course, when you look at a glass of wine, what you're seeing is the wine. You're not seeing the aromas. So you're not seeing rose petals that may be displayed in that wine, or for example, peaches. You're seeing a wine. You need to be able to pull that information out. And so this is what we train to. So I found it super interesting when I started to really work my nose back in the early days. And of course, how I did that was through many techniques. So one of them was I would macerate all kinds of different fruits and put them in vials and cover them up so I couldn't see them. And I would constantly smell them, including spices, anything I could find really. And so they were blind to me, so I couldn't see what they were. And I would identify them at the bottom of the jar. And I would just continually work my nose, work my nose, work my nose. I also had this really cool thing we have in the wine business, and it's called Le Nez de Vin. And it's a lot of the smells that you can get from, and the aromas from actually wine making. So again, back then I would really train my nose, because what I would find is my instructor would say, well, you know, I'm smelling cedar in here. And I'm like, I'm not smelling any cedar. What's wrong with me? And I had to make those connections. What I found super interesting is when I started doing all of this, I started dreaming about smelling. And this totally floored me. I thought it was the coolest thing. So I would be walking through a garden and I would be smelling different flowers. And what are the exact aromas? How do they smell different? Lilac versus, for example, a rose. I remember smelling red licorice candy. So I thought that was really cool. And I'd love to dig into that a little bit more. But as Erick, as you were saying about the whole idea of memory, this is really creating this memory for yourself, right? It's connecting all the neurons, and it's being able to track those smells. Of course, we smell because we need to for survival. We need to for food, and possibly also finding a mate. But it is definitely a lot more complex than that. Why do we have to work on smelling wine? I think this is really important and just kind of fun to talk about, because first and foremost, just like with food, you can imagine if somebody bought a wine, a customer, for example, it was very expensive and it was off. So lots of things can go wrong with wine. There can be all kinds of bacterial spoilage and everything else. But beyond that, wine can get so incredibly deep and complex. And the more that you can pull out of the wine, for example, the more enjoyment you will get out of that wine. Absolutely. And I remember the first times also when I started having those aha moments with wine, because we also try to connect wine to places, and that particular place, that particular grape variety that was used. And, the sense of terroir, which is a French term for kind of the environment, the microclimate that wine was grown in. And when you are studying wine and you finally are able to attach yourself to a wine and a place when it's blind and you have no idea what the wine is or where it's from, it is so exciting, because beyond smelling the grape, you're actually keying in to smelling a place. So for example, Some of my early ones where this happened were in South Australia in Coonawarra. They grow a lot of great Cabernet Sauvignon there, and there's a lot of eucalyptus trees. And I picked up the eucalyptus, which of course is a part of the terroir, and that helped me piece together where this wine was from. So it does get super fun. It can seem really, really silly when you see somebody swirling a wine and nosing it, but all of these actions actually have a purpose. So for example, when you swirl a wine, you're volatilizing all of the aromas in it. And we're looking as sommeliers for, first of all, of course, it not being faulted and it being a clean wine. But beyond that, we're looking at things like what is the fruit and where is it? Are we talking super underripe tart fruit, which could lead us, for example, to a cooler climate? Or are we looking at baked fruit, which could, for example, lead us to a warm climate? So we can smell the climate in the wine. We're also trying to identify what grape variety it would be or blend, because different grape varieties, of course, have different terpenes, for example, and chemical compounds that they give us. And then beyond that, we're looking for age in a wine. So when a wine is youthful, it has lots of primary flavors of fruit, and it can be quite simple. But then as it evolves, it can develop tertiary aromas. So then you start to smell things like honey and petrol and dried earth. And so all of this gives us clues. I think what's also super interesting, I know I'm kind of rambling here, but I was studying for my Master Sommelier exam when I became pregnant with my first daughter. Well, this was a blessing. Let me tell you, it threw me completely. So I don't know what happened. I'm assuming hormones here, but I started to smell red wine. This was a month before my tasting exam, and it smelled like just red wine. I couldn't get anything out of it. And of course, the smell of dish soap smelled completely horrible for some other odd reason. But it was interesting because, for the first 3 months of my pregnancy, I would say my sense of smell completely changed. And I really had to work hard, and I just couldn't get back to that level of smelling wines in time for my exam. So it did come back, luckily, but I thought that was also really interesting. I think, my final point here is that wine can evoke, and your sense of smell can evoke so many things, of course. So many memories are associated to smells. You may not like something now because perhaps you had a bad experience when you were younger and that smell was around, for example. I think what's also important to note is that while we can smell 10,000 things, we all smell differently. And I think that's super interesting. So I'm looking forward to unpacking all of this more with all of you. I hope I didn't ramble too much.
No, it's great.
Well,
Thank you.
that was perfect. Thank you so much, Jen. I'm still one of those people that everything smells like just a red wine to me, but hopefully maybe one day when this is over, I can experience a true wine tasting. But next we have Mazviita, who completed her PhD in physiology at the University of Cambridge and spent several years as a professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh before moving to the University of Edinburgh, where she currently works. And her research focuses on the philosophy of neuroscience and perception. She has written extensively about a wide range of topics, both through a philosophical lens as well as through a scientific lens. And in particular, she focuses on issues related to the perception of color. So
Hi.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's really good to have the opportunity to talk about the senses from all of these different perspectives and dimensions, especially the non-visual senses. And right, so the question for the panel is, how do our senses reveal the world to us? And I was thinking about, what's implied by the choice of words in this question. This word reveal, it's quite a loaded word. It conveys something like presenting the unadulterated truth, or like the final answer on something. And then when we have the word world in this, it suggests, you know, everything, like the totality. And so when we're asking, how do our senses reveal the world to us, that's setting, you know, a really high bar on what we're expecting from the senses. And I think in particular, it's a way of thinking about the senses which is most appealing when we're talking about vision. And that's why it's nice that we're talking about other modalities here, because vision is often thought about as, you know, opening the windows of the world to us, or just like showing us the unadulterated truth. When we mention the other senses, especially, you know, sound and music and smell, we're much more likely to evoke the feelings connected with them, as we just heard very much from Jen and Eric. And that's so interesting because we're expecting there to be subjectivity with those senses. It's not like divorced from how what we're associating with those senses. But when we're talking about the senses revealing the world straightforwardly to us, then we want to step back from the subjectivity, from the emotion that's there with those senses, right? And it seems like if any modality is going to do that for us, that's going to be vision. But in thinking like this, we're setting this really high bar from what we expect from the senses if we think that they could just reveal the world to us, because there's so much idiosyncrasy in our sensory modalities. So it's not just the emotions and the subjectivity that goes with that, but if we just look at color vision by itself, the facts about how color perception work show that there's it's very much tied to what's peculiar about the human visual system. So we know that other animals have fewer or more different color sensitive receptors in their eye from us. So it's, even though we can't get inside the head of a honeybee or a dog or a pigeon, we know that they must experience the colors that they perceive very differently from how a human would. And this raises this question, well, if we think of vision as just revealing the truth about the world to us, how could it be that color vision is correct if there's just these other ways of experiencing color visions? You know, maybe the pigeon is more correct than a human because the pigeon has more different color sensitive receptor types. And this leads us down this path to skepticism, because one might wonder, well, is color perception just one big illusion? If it's just because of how, you know, humans happen to have 3 different kinds of photoreceptors in our eye, and then we see reds and oranges and blues and greens and those particular colors, well, maybe that's just a projection of the human mind and it's not actually what's there in the world to us. So there's this actually long tradition of skepticism about the senses, which really focuses on, well, what is actually there, which is just conditioned or a function of the like physiology of our own eyes and visual systems. And then if you look at the other sensory modalities, then they have their own peculiarities. And then it seems that what we experience of the world is more about the features of our sensory modalities and the sensory organs than it is about what's there in the world itself. So certain people that study sensory systems do end up saying things like, well, it's all just one big illusion. But the upshot for me is that we just need to think in a more modest way about what the senses do. And I think going beyond these ideals that come from thinking about vision and like opening the window of the world are really helpful there. Like we can think of the senses more generally as putting us in contact with things, and they're appealing to a metaphor with touch. So we interact with objects when we touch them. You can't feel what an object is without, you know, picking it up and interacting with it. You can't be entirely passive when you're sensing the world through the modality of touch. And when you're not entirely passive in your sensing, well, you're realizing that you as a perceiver are bringing something to the table. So what you're experiencing in the world is as much dependent on your engagement with it as the world just there by itself. So when we concentrate on vision, we're much more likely to think of it as just passively absorbing information from the world, whereas when we think about the modality of touch, we're able to appreciate that it's much more interactive. And vision itself is interactive, but just in a different way, because we move our eyes around and we move our head around, and that's how we get to see different things. And as we talked about, as Jen talked about with wine tasting, there's all of this activity that has to be done, like how you swirl the wine and how you move your nose and your mouth. That's all part of the sensing process. So, you know, going back to this initial question, this word revealing makes it seem like the sensing process has to be passive in order for us to get the world, but actually it can't just be something that is passively revealed to us. We have to be very active, and that means that we're bringing something to the table. We're not just getting the world, all this information from the world, like unadulterated by our activities and what's going on in our sensory organs and in our brains, but still it's getting in touch with something.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. There's a lot to unpack there, and I really look forward to doing that once we get into the discussion.
Sure.
We have one more speaker to introduce, and that is Arthur Ripstein. So Arthur is, here, let me get my bios in order because I keep mixing things up on my other monitor. So Arthur is a professor of law and philosophy at the University of Toronto. He specializes in legal and political philosophy, and he's an expert on Kant and Kantian ethics. And it's that Kantian perspective that we really want to draw out of him today. He currently has 2 forthcoming books, one called Kant and the Law of War and Rules for Wrongdoers is the other book. Sorry, I mixed those 2 together. But these books they explore the Kantian perspective on evaluating the moral conduct of war and things of that nature. So really interesting work going on right now. Also, very recently, he received the 2021 Killam Prize for Humanities, which is a very prestigious award, and that's a very exciting thing for him. So, and that's in recognition of his very impactful contributions to both philosophy and law, and the relevance of his scholarship to contemporary social issues. So we're very, very grateful to have you joining us today, Arthur.
Thanks so much, Patrick. I'm delighted to be here. When Patrick asked me to participate in this, he was a student in my class on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason last term. And so I immediately thought, oh, this will be great. And then I saw the rest of the lineup and I was actually kind of terrified because the 3 hardest things for a Kantian account to deal with are, of course, sound, smell, and color. And so having experts on each of these 3 things was daunting. But the Kantian account purports to be a priori account, that is, that applies necessarily to all the very possibility of cognition. And so it ought to have something to say about this. And so let me just say a few very abstract things. Let me first say just something about how I think about philosophy. There was a phenomenologist writer early in the 20th century named Adolf Reinach, who said that philosophy begins by marveling at what seems to be obvious. And the philosophy of perception and the philosophy of the senses more generally marvels in particular at something that is completely obvious about our sensory experience, but in fact, deeply puzzling. And that is that, as Mazviita said, we're not just passive when we're sensing. We seem to be in contact with objects. So let me give an example of this. This would be easier to do in person, but in fact, the Zoom context actually lends itself rather well to it. So as I look at each of my fellow panelists and our 2 hosts on the screen, I see them as three-dimensional and embodied. And so not only do I somehow have a hypothesis that there is the rest of their torso and limbs below the camera, but I suppose that were I to look away, they would still be there. And indeed, that each of us has the back of our head as well as the front of our head. That is, to interact with the world through the senses is to interact with a world that is three-dimensional. And I was struck by and relieved, I must say, that both Erick and Jen drew attention to this three-dimensionality because they kept relating both music and smell to locations. Our experience of music isn't this thing that, although sometimes you just zone out with your earbuds in and there could be nothing else going on around you, but in some sense, the full engagement is with what happened as you were leaving the daycare or whatever. And again, you taste the wine and you think the eucalyptus tree, you don't think just this sensory feature. So Jen, I'm gonna have to follow up with you later about the eucalyptus wine because I wanna know if it tastes like cough medicine because that's what I associate with eucalyptus. But again, it's the same thing. We refer our sensory experience to objects. So why is this puzzling? The answer is that there seem to be two ways of thinking about the senses and two components to our sensory judgments, and neither of them seems to contain the resources for thinking about an object. On the one hand, our immediate sensory experiences, which Kant, following a long philosophical tradition, describes as intuitions. And so as you taste that wine, your experience of tasting that wine or hearing that one particular beat in the sequence, it's ephemeral. It's not unimportant, but it's there and then it's gone. And you might remember it, but you're remembering that that's just another ephemeral thing. So too, my seeing each of you on the screen, each moment of, as I scan the screen and look at different ones of you, there seems to be this series, Kant calls it the manifold of these ephemeral experiences. When we make judgments, we use concepts, but concepts are general. That is the concept of a wine. It includes indefinitely, potentially infinitely many things. So too the concept of a color. An object is neither ephemeral nor general in this way. One of the features of the generality of concepts is they are so abstract that we can even think of them as eternal. They're outside of time. What that means, there's a whole philosophical tradition, starting with Plato, for thinking about how to think about that. But the thought is they are so abstract that they are not time-bound. They don't persist. Objects persist. We refer things to persisting objects. That's why I think you will still be there when I turn my head back. That's also why I think of you as three-dimensional. And so the philosophical problem to which a Kantian approach to the senses seeks to solve is precisely the problem of how objects are possible. The philosophical tradition in the modern period, particularly that what we now call the rationalists, coming out of people like Descartes and Leibniz, wanted to put everything on the conceptual side. They were both great mathematicians. They thought mathematics was conceptual. And it turns out there are no objects in mathematics. There are only, as it were, inferential relations. And so we can't really get a grip on it that way. What we think of as the empiricist tradition coming out of David Hume in particular expressly says there are no objects because everything comes from the senses, and the senses never give us an enduring thing. They just give us, as Hume puts it, distinct existences. So there's a whole Kantian story about how to do this that comes out of how to understand this, that comes out of thinking about space as having formal features that govern the possibility of sensation. And now this is why, although colors have saturation and hue and all the other things that Mazviita can explain about them, the names of which completely escape me, nonetheless, they also must be locatable. And the locatability is the beginning of us being able to think about objects. So Patrick said that he was going from the more concrete to the more abstract. And so I have given you a very abstract of kind of the Kantian way of thinking about the problem. But it seems to me if we think about it that way, then we understand again, to return to the question that was posed to us, how the senses let us engage with the world. That is, they reveal the world to us, but they only reveal the world to us because in some sense, our form of thought, which includes both concepts and these formal features of space and also of time, enables us to refer everything in it to objects. And there may be, whether there are objects or not, apart from these formal features of our sensibility, is a question into which we can have no insight. I will stop my very abstract there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really great, and it's great to hear all of these very, very different perspectives, kind of tracing through a really big landscape of different ideas. So I think there's a lot to go with here. Trying to think of what a good way to kick off some questions would be. So one of the things I'll start actually with a question for Erick. So one of these, so Arthur was just talking about a lot of different things, but in part the way in which our sensations of our senses of the world begin with these sort of ephemeral, instantaneous things which just sort of happen. Individual sounds, individual instances of perception. But of course, when you're putting together music, you're not really all that interested in the sound. Like, you're not so much interested in having a sequence of different noises. You're interested in telling a richer story and kind of connecting things in a more integrated way. And on top of that, it sounds like for you, and also for, I think, everybody else, one of the key components of music and the experience of music is the way that it ties in with your emotions. And so I'd be interested in hearing kind of what tools you bring to the table when you're thinking about trying to create music to evoke a particular sort of emotion in a listener. What kinds of tools do you make use of to try and sort of curate a very particular kind of experience for the listener? How do you take individual things and build them into a bigger experience?
That's a really good and complicated question, and I could be very long-winded with it. And I'll try not to be like too technical. It's actually not super technical, but I'm sure people are aware with to some level, there's like major and minor chords, things. Major chords are generally things that make people feel happier. Minor chords, evoke other emotions. So for me personally, when I think about music and feeling, it's actually, like, I say that I'm a DJ, but I'm more actually a musician. I was a musician first, so DJing was just an extension of that. But with music, and I'm sitting down and I'm making a song, it's funny to me. I have many friends who are very like classically trained, musicians. They know every chord, they know everything. And for me, I find that actually quite, I was in school, I was learning music theory, and I found it to be very debilitating, because it took the spontaneity, the kind of randomness, because I'd be like, oh, I know exactly what I need here. Whereas that kind of takes the fun out of it for me. So actually, a lot of what I do now is, I employ, so there's a program called Ableton Live, and there's basically all of these what are essentially generative plugins that you can use that kind of spit out ideas at you. And a lot of them are crap. Every now and then there's one that's good. So usually I'll be like, oh, I'm hearing this thing in the background, just kind of playing, having fun. And if I'm in a mood, whatever mood I happen to be in is what that little thing would come out. I would be like, oh, that's what I'm thinking. That's what I'm hearing. That's what I'm feeling. And then I would take that, and that's where I then start to like add what, my voice into that, play along with that, extend that. Either, it could be mean, I've made songs that are 20 minutes long, you know, sometimes you just kind of like riff on it and have fun. Sometimes they end up being 2 minutes or less. So I guess to say it's like, it's not really, for me, it's not really so much that I go specifically, like I'm going to work, I sit down and I go, all right, today I feel sad, I'm going to write a sad song. Like that's too regimented for me. I'm not that kind of person. I would rather just kind of see where it goes and how I'm feeling. So if I'm, you know, happy today, I'll, you know, go through my toolbox of things that I have and go from there. But if it was too regimented and I sat down and I was like, okay, I'm going to go to this C major chord to this chord, etc. I found myself using too many of the same things over and over again. And so there's this thing that I have, especially with some friends who are musicians, where we always question, it's like, do you ever feel like you've made the same song 100 times? You know, and it's like, yes, like sometimes you just make a new idea and you're like, I've made this before, like, you know, in some different way, but it's exactly the same way. And that can be rather boring. I guess I don't know if that answers the question, but I think I was trying to get there. Oh.
Yeah. It sounds like you bring a whole bunch of different ideas to the table, and you basically just sort of riff on that and see where that takes you. And
yeah,
it seems like you're also saying something like, when you've got too many tools, you get sort of paralysis by conforming to structure almost.
Yeah, actually, there's one thing that I found really interesting with, I'm really interested in studies that are happening now with LSD and other, you know, psychedelic drugs. And I find it interesting that a lot of the studies that I've been reading are in relation to people who are in those experiences are able to kind of, you know, jumble a lot of the things that they've experienced, and they kind of almost refer, I mean, obviously the more educated panelists can chime in here better than I can, but I found it interesting to think about having it be like kind of the mind of a child, in that, you know, your creativity is let loose, you know, all of these different ideas can just come out of nowhere, and are not really coming out of nowhere, but they seemingly, to me and my perception, are coming out of nowhere. And I just go, I like this one, I like that one, and these two things I'm gonna mash together and see what happens. And so for me, as an adult who doesn't have access to psychedelics, I attempt to do that with the tools that I have in my, you know, computer, where I'm just trying to like, hey, like I can't do it in my brain, but this computer here can do a lot of different things, and I can take those from there and start from that.
That's really interesting.
So,
yeah. Thank you.
I hope that helped.
Yeah, definitely.
So I have a question for everyone. Hopefully we'll have a discussion about this, but I guess from either the Kantian perspective or from the neuroscience perspective, we all begin sensing with the same tools. We all have brains, we all have nervous systems, we all have the forms of intuition. We see the world through space and time. And what stems from that are two very different types of sensing in my view, which is we end up with an objective type of sensing, which allows us to do things like science, which allows us to make music that hundreds of thousands of people enjoy, which allows us to, you know, recommend wine pairings to people for whom we don't know what their personal taste is. But then we also have the subjective type of sensing, where, you know, you have your favorite color or you have your favorite song. And I cannot, in my own mind, reconcile the two. How are we able to be subjective and objective with our senses at the same time? And I guess, what are all of your thoughts on that? Because everyone does both in their lives.
I can answer quickly from a wine and a wine buyer perspective. So, you know, you're absolutely right. As somebody who's been into wine for 20 years and I love it, I have wines that really resonate with me, that are my favorites, that tell me a story that I feel connected to. As a buyer, I have to buy and analyze wines first before I buy them to make sure that they're the best quality and they're very good representations and so forth and so on of wines that I don't really like. But I have to be objective and I have to taste through them and I have to analyze them anyway. So I certainly experience wine, I guess, in a way from both sides.
I do that with music. It's music I absolutely love, and there's music for me personally, it doesn't connect with me in, on any level, but for other people, it's, the best thing in the world. So I guess I would say it's exactly the same for me, but with music.
So can I actually ask both Eric and Jen a question about that? Because there's a way in which this is just a familiar human predicament. So I'm grading papers and the student is arguing for a claim that I believe to be false, but I can say, but it's a good argument for a false claim. And so a friend of mine published a book, and one of the blurbs on the back said, this is among the best books ever written arguing for a demonstrably false thesis. So you can see that now in that kind of case, there's a way in which it's because of, in the examples I've just given, it's because of the argumentative structure. You can see kind of how it works, how it's a good one of its type, even though that type is not for you. And so when it comes to, so Jen, you're probably able to appreciate more about wine than I could ever appreciate. But I'm wondering, when you think that this is one that, say, a Philistine like Arthur would like, are you saying this has the kind of complexity that that kind of person would like? Or is it something other than complexity? And again, with Eric, I'm wondering, or when you say, this is terrible, it's going to be a hit. You can imagine music producers need to do that all the time because that's how they make their money. It's going to be a hit because it has, and so are you picking up on kind of structural features, or is it something else?
Well, you're absolutely right when you say that. So for example, as a buyer, I would buy wines that for me have a lot of extra residual sugar, for example, because our North American palate is very sweet. And they would be too sweet for me, and most people would consider them dry. But what they know that they're laced with is this extra sugar, which their palate likes. Also, there's certain aromas that are going to really resonate with the general population of North America, for example, because we're in North America and we love sweet, as I said. So that is going to also come in to play with the fruit. So we're going to like and enjoy riper style fruits, meaning from hotter climates. So for example, we love wines from California or Southern Italy, where if I'm purchasing for somebody who has perhaps more an advanced palate or perhaps is more European, I would be looking at wines that would be more acid driven and display more bitterness and less sweetness. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
I would say for me, it's something similar in that I can actually use one of the songs that I'm listed here on as is one of the first songs that my partner and I did that kind of got us bigger onto a different stage was our remix of Animals. And it's really funny because the second half of that, I mean, that whole song sort of was made as a joke. We were laughing at this, the scene that it was, because the scene at the time of EDM was, these massive crowds, people wanted like this big bombastic music. And my partner and I weren't really known at the time for making that kind of music. So second half of the song is this really huge, big moment. And I remember when we were making it and we kind of laughed at it and we're like, yep, this is shit, but it's gonna kill. And that was it. Literally the thought process was all of 5 seconds. It was just like, this is gonna do it, you know? And I at the time we were younger, so there's definitely a sense of we know better than the audience, certainly. Now I can look back and I was like, yeah, I was a pretentious asshole for being like that. But it didn't mean that our sense of what would work and what wouldn't work was wrong. So in that we were like, yep, this is going to do it, and it did, you know. And so I think at the time we had a good understanding of the. I think in those moments it's really good to understand the audience, and like what Jen was saying, it's like, you know, your buyer, and music, even though it is something for me that's very deeply personal, it is still at the end of the day a product for people to consume. So knowing your audience, knowing the buyer, knowing what's going to work is a very powerful and, dare I say, maybe manipulative thing. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this question, like the subjective and the objective. And there's another way of looking at this as well, which is the intersubjective. It's the way that one experiences the world because of how other people do and the influences that we have from one to the other. Because often what we mean by objective is intersubjective, i.e. a social experience or what others in our peer group would assent to. So say when a group of scientists are making, say, an astronomical observation, and they all agree that this star is at a particular location in the sky. So they're not using instruments, they're just using the naked eye. Then that is an intersubjective agreement. And because they're agreeing and it's not being distorted by their own personal subjective views, then we'd say, oh yeah, it's objective. And then, but I think we can also have this like level of intersubjective objectivity within these aesthetic experiences as well, because it seems a shame that Jen or Eric doesn't have the chance to actually interact with the people consuming their products and actually say, well, you could listen to something differently and you could change your taste. So it's not like any one person's taste and preferences have to be fixed because that's just them subjectively, but there's a whole trajectory of experience and education that any one individual could go through and like learn from someone else who does have access to a richer set of dimensions of experiences. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things that practicing an art form or practicing culinary art or a tasting art really lends a dimension to life, just because you sense the world in richer ways. And I think often this gets lost in focusing on that dichotomy of it's either subjective or objective, but we need to think, well, how can we actually change how we experience the world by learning how to sense differently?
That's a really interesting line to pursue. And I've got a bit of a follow-up question for you, Mazviita, on this kind of social role in sensory experience as well. So you've promoted this view specifically pertaining to color, where color is treated somewhat pragmatically as an interaction between the perceiver and the perceived. And I can't help, I can't help but be reminded of a particular idea that comes up in certain areas of sociology of science, with respect to things like social constructivism and things like that. This sort of Latourian idea of, sometimes the experimenter undergoes a negotiation with the experimented. This is a somewhat radical view in many corners, but there is a perspective that exists for some people that, when the biologist is looking through the microscope at bacteria, they're actually having a negotiation with the bacteria about what theory they're going to form about the behavior of bacteria. And I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on how we do this when we're communicating the sort of intersubjective standards of our perceptual experience of the world.
Yeah. So this interactionist approach to perception, I'm quite sympathetic to extending that into the domain of knowledge, and also thinking of knowledge as this dialogue between a person and objects around them. But then when we're dealing with the sciences, we have to acknowledge that these are these social engagements, and they're negotiated not only from like an individual human and a thing in nature that they're studying, but a whole group and community, and how things arise through that. So I mean, the thing that strikes me in response to your question is, you know, we're living through this mass social experiment right now where normal forms of communication and like negotiating what is reality are being closed off, and so much more of our sense of reality is going through these social media interfaces, internet, and all those kinds of things. And it does, and people are noting, you know, polarization and, you know, divergent accounts of reality coming from one group to another group based on political lines. And it just makes me think that maybe at the heart of that is just the normal process of like intersubjective negotiation towards a shared sense of what is real and what is concrete is just happening in very different ways now through social and technological changes.
That's really fascinating. There's a lot going on there. Yeah.
So we have a question from the audience. I'm not sure if you all can see it in the Q&A section, but I'll read it out anyways for everyone. Have you ever been surprised by the preferences of your target audience in a way which has propelled your sensory knowledge further? And if so, in what way? And I guess I'm going to add to this, which maybe is relevant to, I guess that question is for Eric and Jen, like, have you ever learned about a preference that has made you grow in your sensory knowledge? And I guess as a question for Arthur, is there a sort of a Kantian approach to extending your phenomenal world in that way? So this is a question for everyone, I guess. But I guess Jen and Eric, you can start.
I mean, yes. I guess it's hard for me to pinpoint an exact example, but I mean, I could also go back to the example that I given earlier about, you know, knowing, you know, that was actually a funny experience for me, sitting there and being like, yep, this idea is going to work, you know, and I'm not really questioning it. But after the fact, actually, I didn't really have this realization until I was talking to Gordon, my partner, again recently, where we had a moment where you know, why? Like, yeah, we knew that this would work, but it wasn't really like why it would work. We didn't really have a conversation about why this idea would work. And once I was able, for me, to get past this, you know, over kind of bloated ego of me thinking that I knew more than, you know, my audience, which is, you know, very pretentious. I was able to actually see, I guess, you know, more of the picture as to why this thing was exciting, why it worked better for them. And I think ultimately it changed my view towards, you know, the music that I make now, and has helped me to expand, you know, my palette in a way that for me personally is more gratifying than reading a book about music. Because I think for me, that's kind of the process of learning is by connecting with other people and by doing these ideas and throwing them out there and kind of, you know, throwing them at the wall and seeing what sticks. And so I would say for me that experience was, you know, maybe not initially something that I was able to get the full, or, you know, get a part of the scope of, but I eventually was able to see that, you know, I learned something from it. I hope that helps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can say from from my perspective, the #1 selling white wine in Canada, and therefore, as a purchaser, you have to be aware of it, and you have to understand it, and you have to buy it, is Pinot Grigio. So you may have heard of Pinot Grigio. And of course, when we think of Pinot Grigio, we think of Italy, but the same grape is grown in Oregon and in Alsace called Pinot Gris. And I truthfully didn't really understand why this was relevant or why it was so fascinating or enjoyable by people, and they were buying it. And I did have to dig in, and it really took me understanding winemaking technique here and understand the aromas. So for example, when I used to smell Pinot Grigio blind or Pinot Gris from Oregon, I always used to get mac and cheese. And when I smelled Pinot Grigio from Italy, I always got peanut shells. And I didn't understand why. And through digging in, what I found was that this was actually a winemaking technique, which was called stirring of the lees. And this gave these additional aromas and texture, most importantly. So what you have is a wine that has this sort of smooth texture. I wouldn't say creamy exactly, but not like a skim milk, maybe more like a 2%. And while fairly neutral, it also gave it some additional aromas. And so just really had to dig in and understand what was so intriguing to people about this, what I thought was a fairly neutral and uninteresting grape.
So I'm going to try and answer the same question in a much more abstract way. I talked about the concept of an object and the way in which the senses always refer everything to objects. And part of the story that I left out is that the only way that you can actually make a judgment about an object is by making a judgment about it as part of a public world of enduring objects. That is, it's related to all of the other objects, whether gravitationally or in location to them, and so on. And why does that matter? Well, it turns out that that means that because everything, the things we learn about through the senses are located in space, then different people will be in different, to put it in the crudest visual case, in different perspectival locations in relation to it. And so you will look at something from one side, I will look at it from the other side, and we're each looking at it as having both sides to it. And so it's the kind of thing about which communication is necessarily possible. And it's also necessarily the kind of thing through which each of us can correct the other. Because of course, the concept of perspective in our culture is that to see something as perspectival is to see it incompletely. But to understand the way in which our engagement with the world is inherently perspectival is not to see it as incomplete, but is rather to see it as, in some sense, always potentially, though not necessarily actually shared. And so the possibility of learning from each other comes from the fact that we have a largely common kind of sensory apparatus, and we are, in the first instance, at least in different locations. And so we can make different judgments and we can bring them together, because it's not just that one sensory modality can correct another one, as when my sense of touch convinces me that that was an illusion, but so too, each of us can correct the other. And just coming back to your earlier question, Hannah, about the kind of subjective versus objective, one of the things that we do is that our subjective judgments also can be modified through engagement with others. They can do that because we share a public world. And so that means that if I miss something about a wine and Jen says, well, do you notice this about it? Or Erick says, listen for that. And I was completely oblivious to those things, but they are will be in some sense available to me. And it may be that I will just not be developed enough for all of those things to be available at all, but it's always potentially available. And so we can both correct each other with respect to objective sensation or sensory things, and also not really correct each other. That's probably the wrong image, but at least educate or edify each other in relation to it.
So I have a bit of a follow-up for this, and I think it's kind of jointly directed towards Mazviita and Arthur. And this kind of has to do with navigating the territory between two common philosophical programs, namely empiricism on the one hand and rationalism on the other. So the empiricist will typically say, everything that I can know about the world, I can know through my sensory experience. And then the rationalist will typically say, well, everything that I can know about the world, I can learn by just abstractly thinking about things without having to refer to the potentially problematic or accidental contingent features of my experience of reality. And figuring out how to sit in between those two perspectives is one of the real goals of contemporary philosophy, I guess. And something that's kind of strange related to this last question is that when we've got a whole bunch of different people who are all experiencing the world, and they're all playing this game of trying to make sense of the world around them through their own internal, subjective, individual experiences, nevertheless, they often agree with each other about things. So it might be easy for somebody to say, well, okay, we can't be certain that, like, there's that sort of stereotypical philosophical question of, well, is my red the same as your red? And we go down those kinds of arguments a lot, but nevertheless, at least structurally speaking, we often agree with each other to a remarkable degree of accuracy. Now, perhaps Jen would have something to say about where we disagree with each other in for instance, taste and smell. But oftentimes we get things right. So I'd be interested in hearing you guys comment on that a little bit.
Right. So the question of how we come to agree as often as we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think going back to this question of sociality, I think the answer is because the notion of, individual experience that hasn't been socialized, that isn't through the lens of hearing about the ways that other adults and older children conceptualize their experience and describe it to you when you were young. I think that's the answer. Just because I couldn't imagine having an interpretation of the world if I hadn't been, growing up in a community with other humans that told me, the names of colors and explained to me, what different sensations were. So I have a memory when I was very young, I think it was preschooler, of having pins and needles for the first time and just being really disconcerted by this sensation. And I said to my mum and my mum's friend that was there at the time, I've got stones in my elbow. And they were just saying, what's she talking about? And this was the way that I was expressing what this felt like to me, because it was just so disconcerting. Like, what's this thing going on? And like expecting them to know about the sensation and then interpret it back to me. And eventually I learned that it had this name called pins and needles. But I think, all of our probably individual sensory experiences are like that at some level in our past, we've reached to the people around us to make sense of them for us. And so that's, I think, is the root of that convergence when we do have it.
So I agree with everything that Mazviita said. I just want to follow up and also actually follow up on her example of stones in her elbow, which I have to say, I wish that was the idiom people used instead of pins and needles, because in fact, it actually captures it better. But I want to just draw attention to the way in which it captures it, because it refers it to something public. Mm-hmm. And even though you're talking about something that is in some sense, not happening out in the world. Obviously, it's happening in some location in your body, or at least you experience it as happening at some location in your body. The vocabulary through which you are able to articulate it is a public vocabulary. And so the agreement that we have is, as a general matter, agreement in judgments. And when you have this seemingly idiosyncratic and perplexing experience. So Mazviita couldn't say to her mother and her mother's friend, look over there. You can't point to it, you can just name it. But you can only name it by using a vocabulary, and vocabulary is public. And so you can kind of, we think of ourselves as having the possibility of conceptualizing things in the absence of language. Is that actually possible? That's kind of an entire further philosophical discussion about whether that is in any way possible. But if you want to know whether it's actual, the answer is language users conceptualize things with concepts provided by a public language. That's one of the challenges that translators sometimes face, because languages are talking about the same public world, but they will use different vocabularies and sometimes draw different distinctions that don't fit perfectly. I would guess that different musical cultures do the same kinds of things, and different, probably, gustatory cultures do the same, or olfactory cultures do different kinds of things. And so I know nothing about wine. I know a little bit about coffee, and I know enough about sociology to know that anyone who's interested in anything has a certain kind of hubris. And so these coffee websites will tell you that an espresso has 6,000 times as much complexity as the fanciest glass of red wine. No idea if that's true or not. But whether it's true or not, there's vocabulary for espresso and there's vocabulary for wine, and there is probably mismatch between them. But nonetheless, because we're always using these kind of public concepts, we can get agreement. Now, suppose that the way in which one of you experienced the color red was different than the way in which I did, but the conditions in which you experienced it were exactly the same. Well, then we would be able to agree that things are red, regardless of whether our internal red meters were any different. Now, that doesn't mean that they could be different. It just means that the agreement doesn't depend on that, because agreement it tends to be about public things.
I guess since we're coming toward the end, I want to open up the Q&A section to everyone in the audience. So if there are people in the audience who want to ask questions, they can submit them to the Q&A button. But I guess as those are coming in, I actually have a somewhat follow-up question to Arthur's discussion of perspectival viewing. And since you're our panel lawyer, how does that play into things that rely on, eyewitnesses and accounts in a courtroom setting? Because we're relying on perspectival accounts to give us a truthful account of something that happened. So can you speak to that with from a lawyer perspective?
Begin with a disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. I'm not a member of the bar, and so that none of this is legal advice or commentary. But I think one of the things to recognize about the legal context that makes it unrepresentative in certain kinds of ways, and I think one of the things that arguably went wrong in early modern philosophy with someone like Locke is taking basically juridical concepts like evidence and trying to generate an epistemology out of them. And the reason that I mention that is that in the context of a trial, obviously the point of a trial is in some sense to get to the truth, but that's not the whole point at all. And in particular, the trial is always structured by burdens of proof, burdens of coming forward with evidence, and so on. And that's particularly significant because our legal system begins with an assumption that nobody did anything wrong, and that anyone who says that someone else has done something wrong has to establish that. And they have to establish it in kind of a personal way. And that leads to things happening in courtrooms that you might think just in terms of making a case for establishing the truth ought not to be given that much significance, or ought not to be dismissed in the ways in which they are in a courtroom. So courtrooms famously will not rely on naked statistical evidence. There's a large literature trying to explain this because it's easy to point out witnesses are fallible. And so you can therefore attach a probability to this witness being mistaken. But we let the jury or other finder of fact listen to the witness. On the other hand, the statistician comes in and says that 80% of the buses in this town were run by the blue bus company and 20 by the red bus company. So it probably was a blue bus that injured the plaintiff. And the court says, no, we're not going to do that, because you haven't in some sense brought that to bear on the person who is accused of having done wrong. And so there are all of those things that change it. And so because of that, I think it's very misleading to then kind of take these kinds of concepts and then apply them to the way in which we learn from the senses. So that's not really an answer to a question. It's kind of a principled reason for refusing to answer it. So I hope that's okay. At least it's not.
Yeah, that's perfect.
That's awesome. So there's a couple of questions now from the Q&A from the audience. So let's go to the first one there. So the first question is from Tomasz, who says, connected to the recent discussion, there are experiences and perceptions that are potentially available to each person, but we may need certain social structures to access or discover them. What do you think is the extent of experiences that are not potentially available to any person at present, but are possible in principle, as compared to the extent of perceptions available to us right now? So that seems like a really big question, and I don't know who wants to tackle it first, but
Not sure.
Well, one way to think about this is with technologies which can enhance or add new modalities. So certainly it's already been done that it's possible to give a human being a new modality to detect magnetic fields by giving them the right kind of sensing equipment and then having that connect with their nervous system in a regular way. So it seems like the realm of like possible sensory experiences is quite open-ended, though I wouldn't want to put a quantity on like what proportion to compared to what we have.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think more generally, even within familiar sensory modalities, degrees of resolution might be considerably greater. If you think of the invention of the microscope in the 17th century, it's unbelievable that there was this change in what you could see. And then there's the further question when electron microscopy was developed in the 20th century. Is that seeing more, or is that something different? And I think there are all kinds of interesting questions about that. So too, we have new ways of measuring things, and the possibility of more fine-grained measurement it's not obvious that that's just more of the same, or whether it's actually a new kind of modality. And so this is the kind of question that you couldn't know the answer in advance. And so with Mazviita, I say you can't talk about what proportion. Near the end of the 19th century, it was suggested that science was complete. And after the 20th century was a disaster in many ways, but for the progress of science, it was pretty impressive. And now we know you can't say that. But one of the lessons of science in the 20th century, of course, is that if you develop new theoretical resources, then there are new things to look for that you wouldn't have looked for before. And so depending on those things, that will determine what more we can learn about.
Thank you. So now we've got another question from the audience from Matt and Paula. And I think this one is directed more towards Jen and Erick. And so the question is, do we prefer sensory experiences that involve multiple senses over just one, and why? So for example, turning music up and loud will result in low frequency rumbling that might shake your body, and so you get this tactile experience as well. Drinking wine involves taste and smell and color and all things like that. Would that be a general or an individual preference? How do people generally react to that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, I'll speak to it for music anyway. I think it's two things. Arthur was saying about resolution, and I think of, you could have a pair of speakers that don't necessarily paint this picture of music to you. You won't hear the low end, you won't hear the extreme high end. So there are these details that you're missing out on. So I think of amplitude in terms of the low end frequencies. You're just getting more of the picture in terms of resolution of sound. So you're able to experience that a little bit more. As to the answering that and whether do we prefer those sensory experiences? I think that is subjective and up to the person who's experiencing it. I personally love to, put on my headphones, close my eyes, and that's easier for me. Obviously, at the same time, though, with a good pair of headphones that can produce bass, so I am experiencing that. Not necessarily experiencing it in my body, but I'm experiencing it, in a sense, in my ears, and how well they're able to, translate those frequencies to my brain. But in terms of with people, there's lots of experience. I got a show, I'm hearing the music, I'm with people. So somebody who's different, say from me, would prefer that experience. So I say that's a preference.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one thing I do when I'm tasting wine critically, or if I was in an exam situation or judging wine, that I've always done, which is close my eyes. And so I think for me, my answer would be I absolutely do better and focus better on and get more out of the wine, more aromas, when I block out exterior senses as much as possible. So for example, when I'm helping to train somebody, some of the techniques we use are perhaps Erick having really loud music in the background, because we really want to work against anything that could possibly come up in a situation, and that can be a distraction as well. So utilizing things like that, things that happen. Like for example, one of my exams, I got dropped off on the wrong side of the university and I was almost late for my tasting. So I actually ran across the university to get to the tasting. And at that point, my adrenaline was so high, I was in kind of fight or flight mode, and it was horrible. It was literally the worst tasting I ever did. I could not be present. I could not be grounded. And I couldn't focus on what was in the glass. My heart was racing too much. So for me personally, I definitely experience smelling much better with less distraction.
Awesome.
That's very interesting. That reminds me of that funny joke where people, you're driving and then, oh, I have to turn down the music to see better. But it's
Yeah.
true. It's precisely that focus that you need, and that I really connected with that, Jen.
So it looks like we've reached the end of the time that we'd scheduled for this, and I know that our speakers are all very busy, so they might have to get going. There are still a couple of questions from the audience, so if anybody does have to leave, by all means, we understand. Thank you all very, very much, all of our speakers. It's been really awesome to have you guys come together, and I think it's been a really interesting conversation, getting you all talking to each other and all in one place. And thanks to our audience as well for coming out and helping enjoy this opportunity with us as well. We also would like to thank our sponsors who have supported this, getting this initiative off the ground. So it's the Student Initiative Fund at the University of Toronto. And Hannah, there's something from McGill as well.
The McGill Postgraduate Society has also helped us put together this event.
So thank you everyone for that. Thank you to our speakers especially. This has been really, really cool. If you guys do have time to stick around, looks like there's 2 more questions queued up. So we can get to those, but I totally understand if you guys have to leave, no worries with that.
So I can stay for a few more minutes, but I just want to take this opportunity to thank Hannah and Patrick for organizing this. I think a really wonderful event. And also, speaking of things sensory, I'd like to congratulate both of you on your excellent radio announcer type voices. You just spoke so clearly. I felt like I was being interviewed on the CBC in Days of Old by Peter Zowski or Barbara Frum. And so it's just been a real pleasure working with you.
Thanks a lot. Okay.
Yeah, I'll stay for a couple of more minutes, but yeah, thanks so much for inviting me, and it's really been nice to meet the other panelists as well. Really enjoyed everyone's contributions.
Thank you, everyone. I do have to run, but I would love to watch this again. I've made lots of notes, and it was really interesting hearing your perspective. So great job, Hannah and Patrick, and thank you so much for including me in this. And I hope you all have an awesome weekend.
Thanks a lot, Jen.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you guys. I have nothing to do at the moment, so let's hang out.
Okay, so there's one question which is directed toward Mazviita, which is in response to your comments earlier regarding how often we come to agree. Do you believe there is a way to distinguish between the aspects of sensation that we tend to agree upon and the aspects that we likely experience differently?
Yeah, I don't have a general answer to that question, but I can think of a particular instance where there is something concrete to be said, which is in the case of color perception. In terms of like very broad categorizations of color, so this grass being green, this lemon being yellow, there is this wide convergence that people take, though. And as Arthur was saying, just the fact of growing up in a community where you're in the same context and you'll see the same objects, you learn to refer using the same color labels. And it does seem that, broadly speaking, categorizations and experiences just converge. So phenomena like color dichromacy, what's commonly called color blindness, where some members of the population are just experiencing colors quite differently, they were only really discovered when people started doing experimental psychology and psychophysics of color perception, and actually using lab setups where people were measuring color perception in a much more fine-grained way. So then these color deficiencies were discovered, and also it was discovered that for certain more specific color judgments that you can make, for example, whether a particular shade of green is a pure green that isn't, bluish or yellowish one, there is actually a fair amount of disagreement, even for people whose visual systems are supposed to be, normal and like that. So yeah, it really depends on how precisely one measures color perception, whether you'll say that there's agreement or disagreement across individuals.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah. Now I'm curious if I've ever not, now I'm curious if I, the whole is my red, your red problem, even a very slight difference. Okay, there's one last question. Oh, and before I say this last question, I just want to say for the people who are still on the webinar, because there was a comment by Naomi saying, I hope there are more of these. There are more of these. There's actually one this afternoon. I just wanted to point that out for anyone who's still interested. There's one this afternoon about the epistemology of simulations and of machines and machine learning and things like that. So,
good topic.
So yes, that one is going to be very interesting as well. So yes, the last one is with respect to an evolutionary perspective and the possible tension between what is true and what is beneficial for survival. It seems naive to expect that our senses would be attuned to reveal the world to us in a general sense. What do you think is relevant, or is the relevance of the evolutionary perspective to this discussion?
So I have some thoughts about this. I remember as an undergraduate being told that the reason we see colors is that the visible spectrum aligns with locomotor impenetrability. That is, the visible things are the things that we would bump into if we didn't see them. And I think there's kind of a lot to be said for that story. I'm sure there's a more complex evolutionary story than that. But if you think about it in those kinds of terms, then you see that on the one hand, what we might think of as the naive deliverances of the senses are going to sometimes be tied to evolutionary advantage and so make us miss things. But one of the remarkable achievements of the sciences has been the ability to both bring multiple perspectives from multiple observers to bear on things, but also to allow for, as Mazviita pointed out in response to one of the earlier questions, for us to just increase the range of our sensory modalities. And so the way in which the world, as we might say naively, appears to us may not be the whole picture, but it's not an obstacle. And I think one of the striking challenges for philosophy, at least, that physicist Benjamin Eddington once said that the table is not really a solid thing, it's a swarm of molecules. And it seems to me that the correct response to that is to say, no, it's both. It's not, these are not incompatible distinctions. And figuring out the relation between what can be called the manifest image and the scientific image, that's a very interesting question, but it's a question that begins with the thought that it can be both of these things. And so the fact that our senses have prepared us to flee animals and not bump into things doesn't mean that we can't find out more about the natural world. And at the same time, given that we're dependent on our senses, we're still finding out about the world as we engage with it. We're not finding out about the world as it is, apart from the fact that we are beings with a sensibility as well as the capacity for understanding.
Fantastic. So that brings us to the end of the questions that have been posed from the audience. So I think this is a good place to wrap up. But yeah, once again, thank you very much, Mazviita, Erick, Arthur. This has been a really, really awesome conversation. So I'm really glad that we were able to put this together.
Thanks so much.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
very
you.
much. Really, really enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
everyone.
All right, so I'm going to stop the recording now.